Good morning, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. If you haven't already done it, I ask you to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. But any of you who want to live tweet during this program, we encourage you to do it at our Twitter handle, at WACPhila. We have had a very full lineup of exciting events this spring so far, but there's a lot still more to look forward to. And I want to encourage you to attend our program on May 7th with former White House Press Secretary Dana Perino, and another, I think, really exciting event on May 13th with former Deputy CIA Director Mike Morrell. Director Morrell was acting director of the CIA on September 11th, 2001, and was very involved, personally very involved in the planning and execution of the raid that ended up in the death of Osama bin Laden. So a man who's been present at history and important moments is going to come and share his insights with us, not only about those events, but about the present and future as well. I want to take special note this morning of the presence of our students here in the room, part of our high school program, in particular the Bodine High School for International Affairs. Our speaker was impressed to see you all here bright and early. And I know that some of you, it takes a while to travel here so early in the morning. So we thank you for being here. And it's a great statement about the Council's education program. I want to extend thanks excuse me, to our cooperating organization for today, Tel Aviv University American Friends, and to two very supportive friends of Tel Aviv University and of the Council, Mrs. Poncialis Churchill, the World Affairs Council's President Emerita. I like to say President for life, but she gets to say that. Who suggested today's event, and Judge Rami Gerasi, who's an important leader of Tel Aviv University. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Professor Uzi Rabi, who is the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. Professor Rabi is going to make some opening remarks, then he and I are going to sit in conversation for a little bit, and then we're going to have some questions from all of you. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rabi.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I should first start with some opening remarks, as Greg said, and what we are going to do here is just if I have to confine myself to 10 minutes, I decided, actually together with Greg, to come up with my 5 chapters of my would-be book about the Middle East, or the post-Arab Spring Middle East. So let me just, in a nutshell, come up with those 5 observations, and I hope that this would leave food for thought for everybody to just have kind of a, I would say, stimulating and illuminating Q&A discussion. So basically what we have here is an extreme tumult. I mean, something that has really, really changed the whole panorama in the Middle East. It has been 4 years, more than that the Middle East is something totally different from what you used to have in the 20th century. What we are trying to do is to come up with, as I said, new sets of tools, insights, by which to better analyze the region. The first observation, which happens to be the first chapter, deals with what I call a new political culture. In the 20th century, Arab states in the Middle East were taken as one-man show. Libya was Gaddafi, Iraq was Saddam Hussein, Syria was Assad family, and even the scholarly literature actually referred to those states as kind of a one-man show. Qardaha gang, Tikrit gang when it comes to Saddam Hussein. So for many in the 20th century, the state was to be measured judged, analyzed, in line with the one-man show and his entourage. The Arab Spring had opened the space, a lot of voices coming from within. The political formula by which to analyze political culture in Arab states has changed. To what extent? Well, that depends on the state and many, I would say, factors that are coming to the picture and must be reckoned with. But basically, we have to carefully listen to the voices coming from within. So what we are doing in our center is twittering, Facebooking, in Turkish, Kurdish, Arabic, Persian, speaking to many people in the Middle East. It is a different ball game, and the public at large should be taken as part and parcel of the political formula. The second thing, state versus religion. Sisi versus Morsi, Hamas versus Fatah, Erdogan versus Kemalists, all of them Egyptians, Palestinians, Turks. So what the bone of contention is, on top of the Arab Spring, that was supposed to be something that would create much more liberal and Western-style democracies in the region, paradoxically, it brought in the, I would say, the everlasting question of the Middle East, which could be easily gleaned from the Middle Eastern history. To what extent religion should be instrumental in forging states and societies. This is the debate between Morsi and Sisi. Both of them are Egyptians. The bone of contention, what sort of Egypt I would like to have in the end of the day. An Islamic Republic named Egypt, or a secular Egypt, so to speak, where religion is being respected, but it's being confined and limited as to not dictate the rhythm when it comes to state and societies. This is another key you should use when it comes to states like Egypt, Turkey, Palestinians, whatever. This is something that we should just adopt in some cases of the Middle East. The third observation has to do with what we call failed states. Some of the states here, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Lebanon, from the beginning were artificial. They were held together thanks to the monopoly of power of the one and only, the one-man show. There was a police states in most cases in the 20th century. In those cases where the state was artificial from the beginning, with the toppling of the dictator, what happened is that those states were dismantling, being fragmented to the, I would say, pre-state ingredients. So basically the knowledge of history is very important here, because states like Syria and Iraq that used to be here in the 20th century are no longer valid. And the question comes as to how you're going to analyze that when the notion of state or nation state, a very well-known notion when it comes to the political science of Western academia at large, how you're going to analyze that, and of course, the pre-state constructions, or scientifically put, primordial identities coming to the fore, and we have to make sure we understand what is Sunnis versus Shiites, Kurds, Turks, Druze, and etc. This is a new plethora of orientations, power centers, and if we are familiar with, of course, the language and the history of each part or element, we would better know actually how to deal with this Middle Eastern panorama. The fourth observation, the downfall of the Arab fold. Arab states are being dismantled, the coming to the fore of the non-Arab players. Turkey, and especially Iran, with its bid for hegemony in the region. Persians and Turks are coming from north and east, trying to actually fill the vacuum that was left behind, which brings me to the fifth observation, a change in the superpowers modus operandi. This is something that is really evident all over the place. It has to do especially with the Obama administration, which has become much less penetrative, more hesitant when it comes to the Middle East. and this was kind of an open invitation for radicals and states like Iran who are vying for hegemony to fill the vacuum. And what we have here is a change of the guard. States are being dismantled. Superpowers have changed their modus operandi. A patchwork of shifting alliances, and basically many of the rules, so to speak, that we did hold in the 20th century are not valid anymore, as we said before. So in a nutshell, what we are trying to do is to bring in front of our policymakers, students, audience at large, sort of another understanding, which is based on different keys to be used in order to make sure that while we are trying to understand what the Middle East is, just to make sure we are not going to do that with those, I would say, tools that were valid in the 20th century and are not valid anymore. So what we have to do is just to reinvent kind of a research agenda that would be fit for the ever-changing Middle East. And basically this is what I have to say as sort of a presentation, and we'll take it from here.
Well, thank you for that overview and sort of framing the issues for us. There are so many issues. We could be here all day. So I think we're going to try to sort of rush through to give people at least a sense of some of the important things. I want to start with the highly contested, highly debated Iran nuclear deal or potential deal, the framework. So the President of the United States argues to the American people that this deal is not perfect, but it's the best we can get. It will slow down, in his argument, what would otherwise be an inevitable development of nuclear weapons by the Iranians if they chose to do so. And he makes the further argument, very importantly in terms of American politics, that the only alternative is war. Prime Minister Netanyahu counters very much widely on the world stage, including here in the United States, counters and says, that's a false dichotomy. We don't have to choose between this deal and war. We can get a better deal, a deal that includes constraining the Iranian push for hegemony in the area, a deal that includes the Iranian recognition of Israel as a precondition to lifting sanctions. Who's right and why?
I think that the Israelis are right. You know? But let me put it that way. You know, Iran has an agenda. I can accept the notion that the alternative now, this was not the case 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I think it is becoming too late to act militarily, if you ask me. I was of the opinion that Iran should have been attacked militarily by Israel 15 years ago. But I was said then that there is a lot of time to have that as a last option. Those who said that then say that now it is too late. So basically, I won't delve into too many details about what happened, but the simple fact that Iran is supporting terror groups all over the place, and you're going to have an agreement which says nothing about that. And this is an undebatable thing. They are doing that in Baghdad, in Beirut, in Damascus, in Sana'a, in Yemen. I would argue against that kind of an agreement because it serves to bolster the Ayatollah's reign in Iran, internally and externally, or internationally. It would widen up the base of legitimacy of the Ayatollahs. It would greatly improve their economic performance, and it would give them the keys to decide when and where to turn the nuclear ability for military or civilian purposes into military purposes. Why? Simple as that. And listen carefully to what Ayatollah Ali Khamenei says. I'm not talking Obama and Netanyahu, Ali Khamenei. And Ali Khamenei is much more important than any other Iranian you have heard about. Hassan Rouhani, for that matter, is just the president. And I'm saying just because he is not an Ayatollah. And this is Jamhuriya Islami, which is an Islamic republic. Javad Zarif is a very cunning and shrewd diplomat, but not more than that. In Persian, there is a word, an item called Rahbar, which is the supreme leader, and this is what Ali Khamenei is. And this is what he said 3 days ago, and I quote, lifting the sanctions totally is kind of a precondition to every agreement we're going to have with the Americans. So the Iranians are of the opinion that sanctions are not to be lifted gradually, as the Americans say, but in one shot, at the beginning. Second, if somebody thinks, and I quote Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and you can come up with those comments and ask yourself, actually, what do the Iranian mean by having that kind of agreement? Ali Khamenei says that there are sites which would be off limits for the international inspectors. So for me, if there is an agreement without complete transparency, this is a bad agreement. So I would be willing to remove sanctions, but only in return for complete transparency. And if Rouhani, the president, says, if the Americans and the 5+1 are going to move forward, we are going to show greater transparency. Greater transparency? What is that? Transparency is either or. There is no greater transparency. And since I think they are going to enrich uranium on top of Arak, Natanz, and Fordo, which are places that are being mentioned in this agreement, I think they have an agenda, and they know what they are doing, and they definitely internalize what I said here. They know how weak the Middle East is, Arab states. And I think, sadly, and this is my observation, I'm not saying that I heard that, I think they are capitalizing of what I call the eagerness of the 5+1 to have an agreement. And this is why they are raising the bar, and they are trying actually to get or to make the most of it.
Thank you. Again, we could spend the whole session on this topic, but I want to run through a number of things that I think are all important. So some people would argue that Israel is today in a kind of de facto alliance with the Arab coalition that is fighting ISIS and fighting the Shiite insurgents in Yemen. This is part of this shakeup that you described in your opening. Did you ever think you would see a day where Israeli interests would be so aligned with the kingdoms of the Arab world? And what does that mean to the long-term prospects of Israeli relations with those kingdoms?
Well, I think it's fascinating because this is part and parcel of what I said before, shifting alliances. Since we have no pattern in the Middle East anymore, since everybody sticks to its own particular interests, you have a huge potential for shifting alliances like that. So Israel finds itself in kind of a strange position. The war in the Middle East has nothing to do with Israel. It is basically between Sunnis and Shiites. Now, when we ask ourselves, actually, what should be done because of this fragmented situation, because there are no blocks, what you have to practice on is the practice of my enemy's enemy can be my best friend. This is what we have with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian president, while attacking those, let us say, ISIS organs in the Sinai Peninsula and Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis. This is what we have with Gulf states. As we say in Hebrew, it is not because of Ahavat Mordechai, nobody has become a Zion lover. But they are so anxious about Iran. that they would go to the extreme and have cooperation with whoever can offer something by which to block Iran. The king of Jordan, of course, we do think that if the king of Jordan is being toppled, there would be a disaster in this region. And just look at the map. By the way, this is a false map. This is the map of the 20th century. Everybody is using that. We are developing a new map. I'll show you that in a minute. But take a look at Jordan. Jordan is sort of a bulwark against what we call the sweeping storm of ISIS at the heart of the region. So basically we have some interest and we share that with the United States. We have common enemies, but it is becoming so problematic. Even the United States are supporting Iran and Iraq while fighting against ISIS in Iraq. You see, it is so confusing that I have to just make sure that everything is in order. But at the same time, the Americans are supporting the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen against the Houthis, who happen to be supported by the Iranians. So if the United States is coming up with those different attitude, trends, and modus operandi vehicles, Israel is more of the same, but in kind of a smaller scale. We live in the Middle East. We should better understand what's going on. We are far more stronger, militarily speaking, than anybody else, but we have to be much more clever and much more wiser, like the Iranians, by the way. They are very smart, very shrewd, very cunning. We have to internalize the fact that this is a different Middle East, and then come up with those, I would say, functional alliances, ad hoc alliances. I don't accept the notion of kind of a bloc. This is what we're going to do with Saudi Arabia. This is what we're going to do with Egypt. This is what we're going to do with Jordan. Look at Erdogan actually visiting Tehran, at the same time supporting Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and have behind the scenes some contacts with ISIS. So if you can explain that other than just, a bunch of tactics, no grand design, and everybody for itself, this is how I take it. And this is my observation and my offer to my policymakers, to make sure that the first thing we should understand is where the problem lies, what the problems are. And thereafter actually start dealing with the step-by-step, those, I would say functional or ad hoc alliances.
Let me focus on the Golan Heights. Very complicated situation. Can you describe for our audience what's going on there? What is Israel doing? Who is Israel supporting?
Okay. For example, Golan Heights. Can we move to the next slide, please? This one. No? Before that? Oh. Here is Golan Heights. Just look at this. Okay? Because there is no Syria anymore, Golan Heights was taken captive by Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Qaeda organs in the Golan. Qaeda and ISIS are the fiercest rivals of Iran and the Shia. So what we got there is kind of a power struggle between Qaeda and Hezbollah, which is Iran basically. Who is going to have a foothold in Golan Heights? So what the problem is for Israel? How to make sure that nobody is entertaining himself with the notion of turning Golan Heights, the Syrian part, as kind of another front from which to attack Israel, like Lebanon. So what Israel is sending is kind of a very strict and assertive messages, because we have to be very careful not to be dragged into a war we have nothing to do with. So here is the dilemma. How are you going to send a message by which to deter the Iranians, Hezbollah, or ISIS, Qaeda, not to actually have Golan Heights becoming kind of a new front that could be opened and from which to attack Israel? What we are doing is just we are, offering humanitarian assistance to many of the people who were injured in Syria. This was Syria one time. Now it is kind of an arena of 8 million refugees. 500,000 people were being slaughtered, some of them by chemical weapon of their one-time leader Bashar al-Assad. This is the neighborhood. Israel should not forget that, because everybody comes up with many formulas of how to save the Middle East. First of all, let's make sure we understand. No Iraq, no Syria. And I think that in the coming years, no Lebanon anymore. Sunnis versus Shiites. Kurds adhering or vying for autonomy and independence. Alawistan, this is the land of the Alawites. This is not something that was invented in the recent years. Voices and structures coming from time immemorial are trying actually to restore their one-time glory at the expense of the dismantling state. Golan Heights is just a case to the point, not more than that. We can talk about Libya. We can talk about Yemen. There is kind of, this process of failed states, and it sends negative ramifications to the neighborhood or to the neighboring states, either in Africa or in the Middle East.
Thank you. I want to go back to and focus a little more on the rift between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I really want to get your view on whether or not what we're seeing here is primarily a clash of personalities. You have two very strong men who, with justification, view themselves as historic figures in their own countries. Is this really about the chemistry between two people? Or is there a fundamental shift in the interests, the perceived interests of the two countries that starts to put a real strain on the long-standing alliance?
Both. So I think that there is a clash of personalities, and you don't have to be an expert to have that, but we can argue over Netanyahu's decision to have the speech in front of the Congress. And I can just accept those who are criticizing his style, tone, whatever. But I think that when it comes to the content, I think that there were some arguments which are pretty to the point, right to the point. And they should be addressed by Americans and Europeans with regard to Iran, with regard to other things in the Middle East. Israel should not antagonize the United States. Why? Because they are our main friends, they support Israel, and this is something that Israel has to keep fiercely, because this is, I would say, part and parcel of our politics of survival. But having said that, you have the behind the scenes channels, so to speak. We should discreetly explain to the Europeans and mainly the Americans what the problems are when it comes to Iran. And I can tell you, I read Persian. I'm going through the press. I know what they have in mind. They are capitalizing on what they think, and I think they are right. The Western naivety, or the Western wishful thinking. Just like that. Because even this agreement, according to Obama, has nothing to do with preventing Iran from becoming nuclear. Because according to him, in 10 years' time, the time span of the breakthrough is nothing. So what we have to do is just to come up with some harsh questions to be asked when it comes to Iran. Now, since I think we're going to have sort of a hell in this Middle East, we are just in the beginning. What's going on there is a bunch of horrors that came to be seen after the American evacuation of the region. I tell the Europeans, I also tell the Americans, if you think that you can leave the Middle East as is, to have this vacuum, to create sort of a vacuum to be filled in by monsters like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, let alone Iran and some other lunatics, well, it is going to hit you out of the Middle East. It has started in Europe. And I know that the Europeans have some second thoughts about things. They don't know what to do with the refugees who are running away from Libya, finding their death in the sea. And the Europeans are asking themselves, in this one-time policy of accepting everybody is still effective, if they should actually combine or come up with kind of a mix that would compromise their state interest and their ideals. A lot of questions are being asked, and this is just the beginning. People have to run away because they have no other choice. No other choice. I hope that the world would understand that when it comes to kind of a group like ISIS, messianic, apocalyptic, barbaric, everybody has to leave behind. To leave behind. To leave behind. Sorry. Everybody has to leave behind his, specific set of interests. Come up with a joint effort and make sure that ISIS is not anymore kind of a factor in the Middle East. If we can just for a minute go to the other slide, please. Next. Another one? Okay. This is what we have prepared in the Dayan Center. This is an alternative map. It is being changed day by day. But just to give you an kind of an idea about what's going on, this is the combination of one-time Iraq and Syria. There is no border whatsoever between those two states because ISIS can be found on both sides of the border. The gray zone, so to speak, is ISIS. This is Kurdistan. This is the Syrian Kurds. The Kurds of Iraq depict that in Kurdish Rojava, which means the western part of one-time Kurdistan. This is Alawistan. This is Little Syria, what remains for Bashar. In the Golan Heights, we have Al-Qaeda. This is a totally different thing. So now, I don't want actually to delve into too many details, but the United States thinks still that supporting the Shiites in Iraq would bring back Iraq or would unify Iraq. Supporting the moderate rebels in Syria would make Syria come again as a state. Supporting the toppled president in Yemen, Abdul Rabbu Mansour al-Hadi, would make actually Yemen stable. In all these scenarios, the opposite was the truth. And what we got here again is a dismantling picture, and we have to make sure that we keenly aware of how volatile the situation is. We know who is who, and this is something from which to have a better point of departure while analyzing the Middle East, because people still talk about Iraq and Syria. So what they have in mind? They have in mind the one-time Iraq and Syria. By using these terms, they are internalizing a misleading conception. And we have to make sure that people are changing their vocabulary, their map. This is why the Dayan Center is trying to provide, and we are coming up with a new program, Israel in the Middle East, to provide a new, I would say, socio-demographic vocabulary of the Middle East. Because people have to start to deal with the new organs as they are. If you would like to do something here, you should do that in line with the already existing privileges, not with the pie in the sky. Nobody can create a new Iraq, and nobody can reunify Iraq. The same goes for Syria. Unfortunately, the same goes for Yemen and Libya. And this is something that we have to just internalize and just be aware.
Okay, let me jump to the Palestinian-Israeli issue, which you know, for decades would have been what this program would have been about and what most Americans focused on when they talked about the Middle East. So it appears to many observers in the United States that Prime Minister Netanyahu believes that agreeing to a sovereign Palestinian state, even in portions of the occupied territories, cannot be possible for Israel at any time in the foreseeable future, on the argument that that state would almost immediately be another terrorist encampment, such as exists in Gaza, in Lebanon, in parts of Syria and Libya and so on. Sort of the failed violent state model that you're talking about that Israel can't have as a close neighbor. So what many commentators in the United States, including many leaders in the American Jewish community, have said is, well, that is a risk of great danger from a two-state solution. But in the absence of a two-state solution, you have a de facto one-state solution, which means essentially permanent occupation. In that, the permanent disenfranchisement of what would be a large portion, perhaps eventually a majority of the people that Israel would govern. So this is a decades-long question. Israel needs the land for security, but the people on that land to govern them permanently without full citizenship. Does that not run against, contrary to the founding ideals and principles of Israel?
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think that this is the main question. The paradox is that nobody is that interested anymore in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This used to be the main question in the 20th century. People were taught that way, that if you are going to solve the Palestinian-Israeli problem, you're going to solve the problems of the Middle East. Look at this. Israel has nothing to do with the mess. And this is just the beginning of the mess. So let us just make sure that we understand that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not only not the one and only thing to be talked about in the Middle East, it is a marginal issue, relatively speaking. Now, because of this paradox, it is high time for Israelis and Palestinians, I think, to sit together and to find kind of a suitable formula with which to coexist. What that kind of an agreement would provide the Palestinians is independence and economy. For Israel, that kind of an agreement should provide greater security. So I'm with you. If you can guarantee that Israel is going to be much safer, and there are kind of monetary machinery that would make Israel safer when it comes to its security, every average Israeli would buy that. I can tell you. We don't talk about peace anymore. We have talked about it 20 years ago, and people are frustrated and disappointed by not having that. So rising expectations is the worst recipe in our region. We should not actually provide people with high expectations. Not anymore. So we don't talk about peace. We talk about agreement. An agreement in the Israeli eye is going to be measured in line with security. That's all. So this would be the formula. Now, I think that Israel should go for a two-state solution, because the scenario of one-state solution is something that damages the very principle of a Jewish and democratic state. And we have to do whatever we can in order to make sure that we, at least we, because the Palestinians could have had that when Ehud Olmert was the prime minister, when Ehud Barak was the prime minister. They could have had 97% of the territory. For their reasons, they opted not to take it. And this is just for historians to find out what Yasser Arafat had in mind then. I'm not sure that Abu Mazen can deliver, by the way. What I do hope is that young Palestinians are going to come to the fore. I'm pretty sure that this is what we're going to have in the coming years. I think that Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, and Hania are over the hill. And I think that young Palestinians may be much more assertive, tough nuts when it comes to negotiation. But people who would accept the notion of independent, secular Palestine. I'm not talking about Hamas, because Hamas does not recognize the right of Israel to exist. And we have nothing to do with it. If you don't accept my right to exist, if you speak about one Palestine from the river to the sea, Jordan to the Mediterranean, so we have nothing to talk about. But when it comes to secular Palestinians like Mahmoud Abbas, and I hope that he would, get back to his senses, and Netanyahu too, okay? And both of them gonna sit together and find out a formula that would satisfy both Israelis and Palestinians, at least for the coming years. Maybe we should start with a partial agreement. Again, quantum leap forward is something that we cannot achieve at this stage. And I think that we are in collision course with the states on that. And I do hope that, again, Israelis would better understand that we should talk to the Americans. We should explain actually our predicament. We should explain what our problems are. We should explain that this is the only Jewish state in the world. We should explain all that. And we are just 8 million people, not more than that. And we would like to better our politics of survival. How to do that, that is a problem. And I hope that Israel know what to do, because I think that we are going to have a diplomatic war being waged against us by Mahmoud Abbas. What these guys have in mind is just to come to the UN and to implement the apartheid South African model against Israel. We'll have to wait and see. But basically, this is something that I think in that way it would be a collision course, either or. We have to sit with the Palestinians. We have to, it takes two to tango. And this is high time for both Israelis and Palestinians to sit together because of what I said before. Because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is no longer the most important conflict in the Middle East, as people used to say and have in the 20th century. So I think that, let's hope that both Israelis and Palestinians would know how to find a way by which to compromise and to get something which is much better for their respective communities.
Thank you. I'm going to do one last question, then we'll take questions from the audience. I want to talk about the psychology of average Israelis. On the one hand, Israel is a country with a smaller population than the New York metropolitan area. Yet it has more PhDs per capita than any nation in the world. It has more tech companies, startups on the NASDAQ exchange than any country in the world except the United States and China. Israel is number 3. An extraordinary fact given the size of the country. So one could say that Israel's future prospects are unlimited, that by virtue of its size and the pace of its technology, that it will be the first truly 21st century nation. At the same time, Israel is a country that's more physically vulnerable than perhaps any other in the world, with essentially everything that has been built in 100 years subject to being destroyed by a single nuclear weapon in the heart of the country. How do ordinary Israelis conduct their lives with that dichotomy? Incredible potential, incredible danger.
Another comment right to the point. I mean, you have brilliantly actually focused on the what I would call Israeli psyche. I think that many Israelis actually have in mind that same picture. We have a startup nation, advanced technology. We know definitely what to do when it comes to the outer world. But here is the thing. Our weak point is that we define ourselves as Westerners. We would like to be identified as Westerners by the outer world. The problem is that we are a Middle Eastern state. We have many problems from within, socio-politically speaking. We have, bunch of tribes. We have Palestinians. We have ultra-Orthodox. Zionists, in my estimation, are approximately 60% of the population, and they are debating among themselves what Zionism is. So if you take Israel as a monolith, this is a grave mistake. Yes, it's just only 8 million people, but we have 10 million opinions at least. And everybody actually wants to be and thinks that he knows better than anybody else what Israel should have, what Israel should do. So we have 8 million prime ministers too. So this is very difficult, internally speaking. But here comes the thing. If Israel would not internalize what the new Middle East is, I am afraid that Israel would find many difficulties in politics of survival. High tech is great. Startup nation, great. Advanced technology, great. We have to be much more stronger than our neighbors because of what I said before. We cannot count on anybody for our politics of survival. We have just seen actually how Bashar al-Assad has slaughtered his own people in a barbaric way. And nobody did something about that. We should not forget that. So we have to be strong, but we have to be more Middle Easterners in that sense. We have to get into the neighborhood. We have to be elastic and pragmatic when there is someone to do something with. We have to be attentive when it comes to the Palestinians, when it comes to Arab states, when it comes to whoever we can have an alliance, even if an ad hoc alliance, or better, that would be a kind of a constant alliance. We have to just make sure we know actually where the dangers are and how to deal with that. And we have to wage this diplomatic war by which to explain to the world what the Middle East is and how we can overcome those challenges that we do face. This is a long march. And this is why our call is just to Israel or Israelis, start learning what the Middle East is. It is a paradox that Israelis do not know Arabic. My Arab students are fluent in Hebrew, fluent. My Jewish students know nothing about Arabic, almost nothing. Why? Where does this come from? I mean, this is something that we have to change. So we should come part and parcel of the Middle East, culturally speaking. And then we should build up kind of an Israeli ethos where everybody could find a place in. Because there are many others in our tiny state. A strong state is a state that could just build up or compile an ethos which has the sensitivity of live and let live, which respects the otherness of the other, or tolerate the otherness of the other. This is very difficult, but we have to do that, because we are a democratic state. And we have to just preserve our Jewish character. How are you going to do that? That's very difficult. But I think that Israel would find actually some answers as to how to do that and to get into this march, because this has to do with its politics of survival. And if there is a partner to do that with, we should be there. If somebody is trying actually to demolish Israel, you know, my neighbor knows nothing about the Middle East, and he respects my knowledge. But every time when this guy, Ahmadinejad, or Khamenei nowadays says, Israel bayad maf shavat in Persian. Israel should be demolished in no time. And at the same time, you hear that they are going nuclear. So what would the average person think of? You have the photo of Ahmadinejad with the helmet nearby the centrifuge. Thereafter, he says that Israel has no right to exist. And you are a Jewish boy or girl who happened to hear about the Holocaust from his grandfather, grandmother, father, mother. I see no other alternative for that guy to think that this state, Iran, if it goes nuclear, this is the end of Israel. And you know, you can't help it. Even if I would say, listen, they are not going to use that. This is an instrument they are going actually to put some teeth to their bid for hegemony in the region, which I think so. But it, you know, in the Middle East, it doesn't matter what you have on the ground. What counts is what people have in mind. This is the problem. And the Middle East is a bunch of twisted perceptions. And you cannot logically explain to the Saudis that the Iranians have something else in mind other than hegemony at their expense. Try to. They would tell you. These things are coming from times immemorial. It's not a matter of year or two, not a matter of decades or even centuries. Millenniums. This is the cradle of civilization. This is where everything starts. The Iranians do perceive themselves as high civilization. They depict themselves as Tamaddun Bozorg, high civilization. For them, nuclear ability or capacity is kind of another indication of how progressed they are. So this is why I say, it's not about politics. It's about culture. It's about culture. It's about history. It's about the way people do memorize themselves. The West has been thinking a lot, 200 years, that if people are going to be equipped with parties, constitution, sooner or later they would become a Western-style democracy. Nonsense. 2014 and 2015 have proved that in this region, what counts is my tribe, my minority, my sect, not my country, not my state. Statehood is a Western conception. And this is why everybody thinks of how to recompile Iraq. No way. No way. You are losing your time. Again, try to internalize the fact that things have changed and we have different species here, different organs. And each one of them is vying for autonomy, independence, have kind of a huge dream by which to restore one-time glory. And we have a multi-layered history. I don't want to offend anybody, but when Obama actually congratulated Ali Khamenei when he came to power as president, and he said, let's just have kind of a cooperation. You know, the United States of America, ever since the beginning, is always for compromise, diplomacy, and let us say peaceful resolutions. And the reply of Khamenei 72 hours later on was very indicative. Just to make sure that the new president, which we do respect because he says that he's going not to be biased anymore, just to make sure that he knows that in contrast to the United States, that exists only 250 years or something, you are talking to the Iranians, 3 millennia, the cradle of civilization. You have to understand that. What we are trying to do with our students and policymakers is just to have a sense and an idea about how the mindset of the other is fostered. And this is, you can't do without having a knowledge about his language skills, be knowledgeable about history, get into his mind and see what he sees when he look at the same picture you. It is totally different from what you look at, what you see in life. And if you come to internalize that, this would be much, much better for your future contact in our region.
Global education, we agree. Okay, question from the audience, please. Please.
Hi. That picture gives a really good idea of how spread the new threats are. So my question is, do you see any, the new policymakers and leaders, do you see any signs of these external threats that is at the verge of at the doorstep? Do they have a changing mindset that there's an urgency to resolve the issue between Palestine?
I see the opposite. I see the opposite.
But the question is, based on these threats that are so well depicted on the map, does that create an urgency for policymakers to try to solve at least the Palestinian-Israeli problem?
That should have created an urgency.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
unfortunately not. Because everybody, again, is sticking to its own set of interest. What you got here, and let me show you that. Bashar is being supported by Iran and Russia. The more problems you have in Crimea and Ukraine, the more the Russians are going to stick to their bargaining chips in the Middle East. Okay? So it has becoming kind of a global game, sort of a Cold War. Russia and China are capitalizing on the American semi-evacuation of the Middle East. Players in the region are trying to find out a pattern, either regional or international, for themselves. And basically, instead of a panoramic view that you used to have in the 20th century, you have a sort of a new networking of patron-client relationships, which serves to deepen up the existing schisms, rifts. And this is why I think that we are not going, sadly, kind of a joint international effort. We should have had that, but unfortunately we won't have that. And I think that this would create much more agony for the Middle East.
Do we have a question? I just want to take one from one of our students if there's one. Yeah, one? Sure.
Can you elaborate on the effect of the invalid states in the future of the Middle East?
Yeah, I think that we should start actually thinking of the Middle East not in terms of nationhood or statehood, but we have to respect those primordial identities. And as I said, I don't know if somebody can come up with grand design. I said that there is no thing like that in my opinion. But if you would like to better understand the reality and think of something in the future that would be similar to what we say states, it would be federations, confederacies, that in the best case scenario are going to respect the otherness of the other, as I said before, and create kind of a loose federation or confederation where everybody is going to get his share and slice, but this is for, let us say, medium or long term. We have to go through the horrors of the short term, and that would take, I think, decades. So this is why this is another stage to take into account that even in Europe, after the downfall of the Bastille, in the French Revolution, you didn't get the other way, a Western-style democracy or republic. You know, you had the Jacobin terrorism thereafter. You had Bonapartist dictatorship. You had the restoration of monarchies or kings. It took over 100 years to get the tricolor flag be really established in the Republic of France. So if that took so long in Europe, in the best case scenario, it would take hundreds of years here. So if you have patience for that, We're going to have that in the end of the day, but it will take time.
We like to have, we like to have the really happy programs in the morning. Judge, you're going to be the last one here.
All right, my question is, do you think that the change in circumstances that you're describing here and that we're experiencing was inevitable, or was it due to American weakness after the Iraq War? Which one, how do you see that?
It's a combination of Americans lacking a coherent strategy in the Middle East and the upheaval of the Arab Spring. So this is kind of a lethal mix of unprofessional policy, American, be implemented in the Middle East and the situation itself. Let me just give you kind of an example by which to sum it up. What we are preaching for is to understand the Middle East from beneath, because we do think that culture and history matters. So if you go for Saddam Hussein in April 2003, after going for Taliban in Afghanistan, and that was kind of a byproduct of the 9/11. And the Western spectrum, and I respect that, have two ends: dictatorship and democracy. So the calculus was pretty simple. If I'm going to topple a dictator, this in any case would be a win-win situation, because we're going to have something much better than what we had. To what extent? Let's see. But no Saddam, thanks God. Now, with toppling Saddam, which was a cruel and barbaric leader, we have toppled the one-man show. Because Iraq is composed of different, let us say, elements, religiously and linguistically speaking or ethnically speaking. Those elements took the liberty, so to speak, to redefine themselves at the expense of the dismantling Iraq. Now, in the Middle Eastern sense, if we are coming not that way from the West into the Middle East, if we are coming from times immemorial, and we do see kind of a precedent, be implemented in Iraq. What the precedent is? An Arab state being ruled by Shiites. This is unheard of in the Middle East. If you try to understand why the Saudis run crazy, this is exactly it. They take the new Iraq as kind of a project, a co-production of American and Shiites, of America and Iran. And again, the twisted perceptions make people run crazy. And if you ask yourself why you have this pan-Arab army, it's just kind of a saying to both Iran and the United States: get out of our backyard. And this is kind of a message to the United States that if you would like to dance with Iran, to have a sort of a cooperation with Iran, to have a good time, but we are not going to let you go with that. And definitely not count on you. So this is what I think. So this is a mess, you know. I really think that, I don't think that America or even Russia or something has kind of a grand design by which to solve out the problems. The simple fact that everybody is dealing with Iran and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict can tell you, paradoxically, that nothing can be done about the main problems of the Middle East, which is one time Iraq, one time Syria. If you would like to help out the Middle East, you have 8 million refugees. Children who are being starved to death. Orphans. So try to deal with that. Not with kind of a formula being orchestrated in Brussels or Paris or Washington, D.C. No. This is a tough march. And I'm not sure that somebody in this world is willing or able to start dealing with that. Really.
I want to thank the professor, I want to thank all of you. Thank you. Thank you.